Margaret had always been sharp. As a retired schoolteacher, her life had been filled with words, teaching her students, writing lesson plans, and reading for hours at a time. She prided herself on her mind, believing that age would never diminish her sharpness. But lately, things had begun to change. It started slowly. At first, she would forget the name of a character in one of her favorite books or struggle to recall the title of a movie she had watched just a week ago. Nothing major, just little lapses. She brushed them off. After all, she reasoned, everyone forgets things once in a while. It wasn't something that warranted much concern. She was 63, after all, hardly young, but certainly not old enough for memory loss to be a serious issue. Or so she thought. The lapses became more frequent. One evening, as she sat down to dinner with her daughter, she had trouble recalling the word salt. She stared at the table, her mind struggling to piece the word together. It wasn't as if she had forgotten it completely. It was just that there was a block, an invisible wall, preventing her from accessing it. "Pass me that." "The white stuff," she said awkwardly, pointing to the salt shaker. Her daughter, who had always looked up to her as someone with an impeccable memory, didn't seem to notice anything unusual. But Margaret did. Her heart skipped a beat. She had been teaching English for years, and here she was, unable to find a word as simple as salt. The next day, she was at the grocery store. She reached for the tomatoes, but when she tried to recall the name of the type she wanted, she found herself blank. Was it plum tomatoes? Roma? Cherry? She could picture them in her mind, round and firm, but the name was elusive. She finally settled on the Roma tomatoes, hoping they were the right choice, but the unease lingered. This wasn't normal. She had always been the one to remember details. She'd been known to tell her friends exactly where they had put things or recount details from years ago with perfect clarity. But now, things were different. Margaret tried to laugh it off, telling herself it was probably stress. After all, her life had changed significantly in recent years. She had retired from teaching, and while she enjoyed the freedom, there was a sense of loss that she hadn't anticipated. She was adjusting to her new routine, spending time with her grandchildren, gardening, and reading, but there was something about being away from the classroom that left her feeling adrift. Perhaps it was the lack of structure that was causing her brain to become foggy. She told herself it was just a phase, something temporary. After all, wasn't forgetfulness just a natural part of aging? But the episodes kept happening, and the more they did, the more she began to doubt her own reasoning. One afternoon, while chatting with a friend over tea, Margaret could barely remember the name of a mutual acquaintance who had recently moved away. It wasn't that she had forgotten the person entirely. She could see her face clearly in her mind, but the name just wouldn't come. It felt like a block in her brain, something she could almost reach but couldn't quite grasp. Margaret smiled awkwardly and changed the subject, trying to brush off the incident. But deep down, a sense of unease settled in. This wasn't just stress. It wasn't normal. For the next few days, Margaret became hyper-aware of her forgetfulness. When she spoke to her son on the phone, she found herself stumbling over simple words, trying to find the right one to finish a sentence. It was as though the words she wanted to say were just out of reach, and she had to fight to bring them back. Sometimes, she would find herself in the middle of a sentence and completely forget the direction she was going in. Her son didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, but Margaret did. She began to feel embarrassed, frustrated, and, most troubling of all, scared. Did you know that memory lapses in older adults can sometimes be a sign of something more serious than just aging? Cognitive changes that seem minor can sometimes signal the early stages of a condition called mild cognitive impairment, MCI, which can affect memory and thinking abilities, but doesn't yet interfere with daily life. Margaret tried to tell herself that these little lapses were normal, but there was something in her gut telling her otherwise. She was no stranger to aging. After all, she had watched her own parents grow older, and they had their own struggles with memory loss. But neither of them had experienced forgetfulness quite like hers. It wasn't just misplacing keys or forgetting someone's name every now and then. It was something more troubling, more persistent. The tipping point came one afternoon when she was having coffee with her husband, Jim. They had been married for over 40 years, and in that time, they had developed a rhythm. conversations that flowed without much effort. But today was different. Margaret was talking about a trip they had taken to the beach the year before. But as she spoke, she realized that she couldn't remember the name of the hotel where they had stayed. She paused, her hand frozen midair as she tried to summon the name. Jim, sensing something was wrong, gently prodded her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Margaret forced a smile. "I'm fine," she said, brushing it off. But inside, panic was starting to set in. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. She had always been able to recall details, to paint pictures with words. Now those details were slipping away like grains of sand. It was as if she was watching herself fade, and she had no control over it. Later that evening, Margaret decided to do some research. She opened her laptop and typed memory loss in older adults into the search bar. She sifted through pages of articles, trying to make sense of what was happening to her. Most of what she read pointed to the normal cognitive decline that came with aging. It seemed that some forgetfulness was inevitable as people got older. But as she read further, she found articles mentioning mild cognitive impairment, MCI, a condition that affected memory but didn't yet interfere with daily life. It was often a precursor to more serious conditions like Alzheimer's disease, but not always. Margaret's heart skipped a beat as she read through the symptoms, forgetting words, misplacing items, struggling with familiar tasks. She had experienced all of these things. She couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't just about aging. Something was wrong. The next morning, Margaret made an appointment with her family doctor. She had always trusted Dr. Harris. He had been her doctor for years. He listened patiently as she described her symptoms, explaining the lapses in her memory and how they had been affecting her daily life. Dr. Harris assured her that some forgetfulness was completely normal for people her age and that many of his patients experienced similar issues. But he also told her that if she was concerned, they could run some tests to rule out any underlying conditions. Margaret agreed, though she wasn't entirely reassured. The tests were simple enough, a series of cognitive assessments that measured her ability to recall words, recognize patterns, and solve problems. It felt like a school exam, but instead of teaching the material, she was the one being tested. As she sat in the quiet room, answering the questions as best as she couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away from her. When the tests were over, Dr. Harris gave her a tentative diagnosis, early-stage MCI. Mild cognitive impairment wasn't a death sentence, but it was a warning sign. For some people, MCI could remain stable for years, with only minor memory lapses. But for others, it could progress into something more serious like Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia. Margaret left the doctor's office that day with more questions than answers. She wasn't sure how to feel, relieved that it wasn't something worse, or terrified that the memory problems she was experiencing might eventually take away her ability to live independently. But one thing was certain, this wasn't just a normal part of aging. Margaret had entered a new chapter in her life, one that would require her to face her fears, adapt to new challenges, and take action before it was too late. As she walked out into the bright sunlight, she didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew she couldn't ignore the warning signs any longer. The drive home from Dr. Harris's office was a blur for Margaret. Her mind was racing, and she could hardly concentrate on the road in front of her. The diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment, MCI, echoed in her thoughts, looping over and over like a haunting refrain. Early-stage MCI. The term was unfamiliar, clinical, and unsettling. What did it mean? Was it truly something to worry about? She couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away, and yet she clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't as bad as it seemed. As Margaret pulled into her driveway, she realized she had no memory of the journey. Her hands were still gripping the steering wheel, but her fingers were numb. The engine sputtered to a stop, and she sat in the car for a moment longer, staring blankly ahead. She hadn't expected this. A part of her thought that maybe she was imagining the forgetfulness, that perhaps her occasional lapses in memory were just signs of getting older. But hearing the words mild cognitive impairment from Dr. Harris had been like a punch to the gut. She had never really thought of herself as old. She had always felt sharp, in control. But now, That feeling was slipping through her fingers, just like the words she couldn't quite grasp. Inside the house, Jim was sitting in his favorite chair, flipping through the newspaper. When Margaret walked in, he looked up at her with a warm, concerned smile, but she didn't return it. Instead, she stood in the doorway, still processing the conversation with Dr. Harris. Jim, noticing the change in her demeanor, set the paper down and stood up, his brow furrowing. "Margaret, what did the doctor say?" She paused for a moment, unsure how to answer. How could she explain the weight of the diagnosis, the fear that had suddenly taken root in her chest? She had always been the strong one, the one who managed things with grace and poise. But now, she felt fragile. She didn't want to burden Jim with her fear, but at the same time, she couldn't keep it inside any longer. "It's MCI," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "Mild cognitive impairment." Jim blinked, clearly not understanding. "MCI? What does that mean?" Margaret hesitated, her mind scrambling for the right words. "It means my memory is starting to fade. The doctor said it's early stage, but it could get worse." The words hung in the air between them, and she could see the concern creeping into Jim's face. He moved toward her, pulling her into an embrace. But even his touch didn't bring the comfort it once did. The truth was out now, and no amount of reassurance could change the reality of the situation. Jim tried to console her, telling her that many people experienced some memory loss as they got older, and that MCI didn't always progress into something worse. But Margaret couldn't shake the sense of dread that settled in her stomach. She had spent her life teaching children to trust in the power of memory, the beauty of language. But now, it felt as though those things were slipping through her fingers like sand in the wind. The days that followed were filled with a strange mixture of denial and quiet panic. Margaret didn't tell anyone else about the diagnosis. Her children, her friends, even her neighbors. She couldn't bear the thought of people pitying her, treating her differently because of something she had no control over. She didn't want to be seen as the lady who's losing her mind. She had always been the one who remembered everything. The birthdays, the anniversaries, the small details of people's lives. She couldn't fathom becoming someone who was forgetful, someone who had to rely on others to remember for her. Instead, Margaret convinced herself that she could handle it on her own. She didn't need help, didn't need to talk to anyone about it. The idea of accepting the diagnosis felt like surrender. She wasn't ready to admit that her mind was changing, that the things she had always relied on might one day betray her. So she continued with her routine, keeping busy with the things that had always given her joy. She spent time in her garden, read books, and attended church on Sundays. But no matter how hard she tried to distract herself, the feeling of dread always loomed in the background. It wasn't just the memory lapses that terrified her. It was the unknown. How far would this go? Would she wake up one day and not recognize the faces of her children or grandchildren? Would she forget how to make her famous apple pie? Or worse, forget how to cook altogether? The thought of losing her independence, her sense of self, was unbearable. One evening, after dinner, Margaret sat down with Jim to watch television. As they flipped through the channels, she was struck by an unsettling thought. What if this is just the beginning? What if the forgetfulness she had been experiencing was just the first sign of something much worse? It was easy to push those thoughts aside during the day, to focus on small tasks, and try to maintain a sense of normalcy. But at night, in the quiet, when the house was still, the fear was always there. Jim, sensing her distress, gently asked, "Are you okay, Margaret? You've been awfully quiet tonight." Margaret forced a smile, trying to mask the turmoil inside her. "I'm fine," she said, her voice thin and brittle. "Just tired." But the truth was, she wasn't just tired. She was terrified. She didn't know how to explain it, didn't know how to share the fear that had lodged itself in her chest. She didn't want to burden Jim with her worries. After all, what could he do? There was no cure for MCI, no magic pill to reverse the damage. She had to face it alone. The next few days were a blur of normalcy and anxiety. Margaret continued to experience the occasional memory lapse, though they weren't always consistent. Sometimes she would forget a word. Other times she would struggle to recall a detail she had known her entire life. But there were moments, too, when she felt fine, when her mind felt clear and sharp. It was in those moments that she allowed herself to believe that maybe it wasn't so bad. Maybe the doctor had been wrong. Maybe it was just stress. Maybe it was nothing more than the natural process of aging. But deep down, Margaret knew the truth. The fear was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. And it wasn't just about memory. It was about the possibility of losing herself, of no longer being the person she had always been. She wasn't ready for that. She didn't know how to be someone else. So she kept pretending, kept pushing the fear aside, hoping it would go away on its own. She continued to tell herself that it was just a phase, that it would pass. But every time she forgot a word, every time she struggled to recall a name or detail, that little voice inside her whispered, "What if it's more than just aging?" At night, Margaret would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She thought about the things she loved, her family, her home, her books. She thought about the future and what it might look like if her memory continued to decline. It wasn't just the fear of forgetting things that troubled her. It was the fear of forgetting who she was. What would be left if she couldn't remember the things that had defined her for so many years? One afternoon, as Margaret sat at the kitchen table, sorting through a pile of old photographs, she found herself staring at a picture of herself and Jim from their early days of marriage. She was young, vibrant, with a sparkle in her eyes that she hadn't seen in years. The picture was a reminder of who she had been, of the woman who had always prided herself on her sharp mind and quick wit. But now, that woman seemed like a distant memory, a shadow of someone she used to be. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at the picture. She didn't want to let go of that version of herself. She didn't want to be the person who needed help, the person who couldn't remember the names of her grandchildren or the ingredients for her favorite recipes. She wasn't ready for this. She didn't know if she would ever be ready. Margaret had always prided herself on being strong. She had faced challenges in her life, from raising children on a modest teacher's salary to supporting Jim through his health problems. But this felt different. This wasn't something she could fix. This wasn't something she could will away. And so, as the days passed, Margaret continued to deny the truth, even as it gnawed at her insides. She kept up appearances, kept busy, kept pretending. But deep down, she knew she couldn't run from the truth forever. It was there, lurking just below the surface, a constant reminder that things were changing in ways she didn't understand. The dread grew, quietly, steadily, until it became an ever-present companion in her life. The weeks following Margaret's diagnosis felt like an emotional roller coaster. Each day was a mix of hope and despair, of denial and grudging acceptance. She had tried to ignore it, to convince herself that the memory lapses were just a temporary glitch, that she was simply going through a rough patch. But as much as she tried to suppress her growing fear, she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. And so, after several weeks of internal struggle, Margaret realized that she couldn't continue living in denial. She needed answers. It was a Saturday morning when Margaret made up her mind. She had been up early, as usual, tending to her garden. The garden had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in the beauty of the flowers and the satisfaction of a well-tended bed of herbs. It had been a way for her to connect with the world, to feel grounded. But that morning, as she knelt down to trim a rose bush, she found herself struggling to recall the name of a particular flower she had planted just last year. Her hands froze mid-motion as she stared at the plant, unable to remember whether it was a daffodil or a tulip. The name was right there, just on the tip of her tongue, but it eluded her. She sighed deeply, feeling the weight of her condition settle heavily on her shoulders. Later that afternoon, Margaret sat down at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in front of her. She opened her laptop, the screen lighting up her face in the dim light of the room. The words "mild cognitive impairment" filled her search bar, and she clicked through the first few links that popped up. She read articles, watched videos, and tried to make sense of the diagnosis that had turned her world upside down. Most of the content she found was centered around the idea of accepting aging, offering tips on how to live with memory loss and improve mental clarity. But it didn't answer the question that was gnawing at her. What if this was something more than just aging? Margaret knew that early-stage MCI wasn't a definitive diagnosis. It was a kind of middle ground, too significant to be ignored, yet not enough to be classified as a more serious cognitive condition. She needed to know more. She needed clarity. That evening, Margaret decided to call her son, Stephen. He was the one she had always turned to when life felt too overwhelming, the one she could rely on for support and guidance. He had a calm, practical nature that always helped her regain perspective, as she trusted him more than anyone else in the world. As soon as Stephen picked up, she wasted no time in getting to the point. "Stephen, I need help. I think I need to see a specialist." Stephen immediately recognized the tone of his mother's voice. He knew that something had been weighing on her for weeks, and it didn't take much for him to piece together that the memory issues she had been dealing with were more serious than she had been letting on. "Of course, Mom. What kind of specialist do you have in mind?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "I don't know where to go from here. I don't want to just sit around waiting for things to get worse. I need to understand what's really going on." "Let's figure it out together," Stephen reassured her. "I'll do some research, and we'll find someone who can help you understand what's happening. We'll take it one step at a time, okay?" Margaret felt a rush of gratitude, and though she wasn't quite ready to face her fears, knowing that her son was there to support her gave her a sense of comfort. It was the first time in weeks that she felt a glimmer of hope. The next day, Stephen called her with a list of neuropsychologists and specialists who worked with older adults dealing with cognitive issues. Margaret's heart fluttered with a mix of relief and nervousness. She had always been independent, and the idea of seeking help felt like a step she wasn't entirely ready to take. But she knew that it was time to face the reality of her situation. After a few calls, she scheduled an appointment with a well-regarded neurologist named Dr. Peter Clark, who specialized in cognitive health. He came highly recommended by Stephen's research and was known for taking a compassionate, holistic approach to his patients' concerns. Margaret, despite the unease that lingered in her chest, felt a small sense of relief. She had taken the first step toward understanding what was really going on. The day of her appointment arrived, and Margaret's nerves were frayed. She had woken up early, unable to sleep the night before, her mind racing with 1,000 questions. Would Dr. Clark confirm her fears? Would he tell her that there was nothing they could do to stop her cognitive decline? She had lived her life with confidence, but now, as she sat in the quiet waiting room of the clinic, she felt small and vulnerable. When she was finally called into Dr. Clark's office, she tried to compose herself. The doctor greeted her warmly, offering a handshake and a smile that was both professional and reassuring. He invited her to sit down, and Margaret took a deep breath before speaking. "Dr. Clark," she began, "I've been having some memory issues for a while now, and I'm really worried about what might be happening. My doctor diagnosed me with early-stage mild cognitive impairment, but I need to know more. I need to understand what's going on with my brain." Dr. Clark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand your concerns, Margaret. It's not uncommon for people to feel uncertain or scared when they first hear about MCI. It's important to take this seriously, but it's also important to understand that MCI doesn't necessarily mean that you'll develop Alzheimer's disease or another type of dementia. It's a gray area, and that's why it can be so confusing." He spent the next hour talking to Margaret about the nature of MCI, explaining that it was a condition characterized by noticeable memory lapses that were beyond what one would expect from normal aging. He reassured her that, for many people, MCI remains stable or even improved with lifestyle changes, cognitive therapy, and other interventions. However, in some cases, it could progress to more serious conditions like Alzheimer's. The unknowns were what made MCI so difficult to navigate. Dr. Clark also conducted a series of cognitive tests, asking Margaret to recall words, solve puzzles, and perform other mental exercises. The tasks were challenging, and Margaret found herself struggling with some of the questions. Her heart raced as she tried to focus, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of panic when her brain couldn't respond as quickly as it once did. When the tests were finished, Dr. Clark gave her a reassuring smile. "Your results suggest that you are experiencing some cognitive changes, but they are not severe at this point. The good news is that we can take steps to slow down any potential progression and improve your brain health." Margaret felt a flicker of hope in her chest. "What kind of steps?" She asked eagerly, wanting to know what she could do to take control of her health. Well, there are several lifestyle changes and therapies that can be very effective in managing MCI, Dr. Clark explained. For one, maintaining a healthy diet that's rich in antioxidants, omega-3 fatty acids, and other nutrients has been shown to help protect the brain. Regular physical exercise is also crucial. Walking, swimming, anything that gets your body moving. Cognitive exercises and brain games can help keep your mind sharp, and social engagement is equally important. The more you challenge your brain and stay connected with others, the better. Margaret nodded, absorbing the information. It was a lot to take in, but the idea that she could actively work to improve her cognitive health gave her a sense of purpose. Dr. Clark also mentioned that medication wasn't always necessary for MCI, but in some cases, it could be prescribed to address specific symptoms or manage related conditions. Before she left the office, Dr. Clark gave Margaret a list of resources, including recommendations for cognitive therapy groups, physical fitness programs, and dietary guidelines. He told her that she should return for follow-up appointments to monitor her progress and adjust her treatment plan as needed. As Margaret walked out of the clinic, a weight seemed to lift from her shoulders. She had come to terms with the fact that there was no magic cure for MCI, but she also understood that there were things she could do to take control of her future. The fear she had carried for so long had been replaced with a sense of agency. She didn't have to sit idly by and wait for her cognitive decline to worsen. There were steps she could take, actions she could make, to help her mind stay as sharp as possible for as long as possible. That evening, Margaret sat down with Jim and shared what she had learned. "I've got a plan now," she told him, her voice filled with a renewed sense of determination. "I can't stop this completely, but I can slow it down. And that's what I'm going to do." Jim reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "We'll do this together," he said, smiling. "You're not alone, Margaret. We'll fight this with everything we've got." For the first time in months, Margaret allowed herself to believe that there was hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it with a new perspective, one that embraced action, support, and the knowledge that while she couldn't change everything, she could still control her response to the challenge. She had taken the first step toward understanding her condition, and now she was ready to take the next one. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but at least now, she knew she didn't have to walk it alone. The days that followed Margaret's visit to Dr. Clark's office were filled with a strange mix of clarity and doubt. On one hand, she felt as though a fog had lifted. For the first time since her initial diagnosis, she had concrete steps to take, real actions to put into motion. The uncertainty that had plagued her for weeks now had a direction. She could fight this. On the other hand, though, there was still the looming presence of fear. MCI was an uncharted territory, and as much as she wanted to be strong, the uncertainty of it all felt suffocating at times. Her days began to follow a new rhythm. Every morning, she would wake up early, as she had always done, but now there was a purpose behind her actions. First, she would head out into the garden, her hands working steadily as they always had. The flowers needed tending, and she found solace in the familiar motions of weeding, trimming, and watering. Gardening had always been her way of meditating, a quiet space where she could reconnect with herself. Now, it was a ritual, a form of grounding herself, as she braced for the challenges ahead. The first change Margaret made was to her diet. She had always prided herself on eating healthy, but now, every meal became an opportunity to nourish her brain. She added more leafy greens, berries, and fatty fish rich in omega-3s to her shopping list. She started paying closer attention to antioxidants, foods that could protect her brain from oxidative stress. She read up on Mediterranean-style diets, which have been shown to benefit cognitive health, and began to experiment with new recipes that incorporated more whole grains, legumes, and nuts. Every time she prepared a meal, it felt like she was taking control of something she could manage. It was small, but it was something. Jim was initially hesitant. He had always been the one to enjoy the simple, comfort food they'd eaten for years. But seeing Margaret so committed to these changes, he decided to join her. He might not have fully understood the science behind it, but he supported her in a way that felt deeper than just words. He found himself swapping out his afternoon snack of chips for a handful of almonds or blueberries. He even found himself sneaking kale into his morning smoothies, despite his protests at first. They would laugh together, their kitchen now a place for experimentation with flavors and a newfound sense of camaraderie. In addition to dietary changes, Margaret became more intentional about physical activity. Before, she had always been relatively active, walking to the mailbox, taking the occasional trip to the park with Jim. But now, she enrolled in a local fitness class specifically designed for older adults. The class focused on balance, flexibility, and low-impact exercises, all aimed at improving brain health and physical wellness. Margaret was surprised by how much she enjoyed it. The instructors were encouraging, and the group of participants became more like a small family over time. It wasn't just about the exercise, it was about forming connections, pushing herself, and creating a sense of purpose beyond the walls of her home. The first few weeks of this new routine were difficult. There were days when Margaret's energy felt drained, when the mental fog crept back in, and when the reality of her condition threatened to consume her. But as she worked through the exercises and experimented with new recipes, she started to notice small changes. Her memory wasn't perfect, but it seemed more stable. The panic that had gripped her heart every time she forgot a word was slowly being replaced with a sense of control. She was doing everything she could to slow the progression of MCI, and that, at least, brought her a sense of peace. Social engagement, which Dr. Clark had emphasized, became another important part of Margaret's strategy. For so many years, Margaret had been the one to host family gatherings and play bridge with friends on the weekends. She had always been the social glue, the one who remembered the small details, the one who knew what everyone needed before they even asked. But as the memory lapses began, Margaret had found herself retreating. The idea of forgetting someone's name, of not being able to follow a conversation, had filled her with dread. She had grown used to being the one in control, and losing that felt like losing part of her identity. But with Dr. Clark's encouragement, Margaret slowly began to reintroduce herself into social situations. She started attending book club again, where she had always been a cherished member. At first, she felt a sense of embarrassment as she stumbled over remembering characters or plot points. But the group was kind, supportive, and understanding. No one judged her for those small lapses. In fact, they were more than willing to help her along, even turning those moments into lighthearted exchanges. Margaret began to realize that it wasn't the memory lapses that defined her, but how she responded to them. She could still enjoy the conversations, still contribute in meaningful ways, and still be a valued part of her community. Perhaps the most important change was in her relationship with Jim. Over the years, their bond had deepened, but now, with Margaret's diagnosis, it took on a new dimension. Jim had always been her rock, her steady presence, but as her memory began to slip, he found new ways to support her. Their relationship became more about shared moments than about trying to fix anything. Jim didn't need to understand all the nuances of MCI. He simply needed to be there, present, patient. He learned to be a little more mindful, offering gentle reminders when Margaret forgot something important, but never making her feel inadequate or less than. There was no need to pretend everything was perfect. Instead, they learned to accept the imperfections, knowing that their connection went beyond remembering every detail. Margaret had always been independent, fiercely so, but she now understood that asking for help didn't make her weak. It made her human. She had a support system, a network of people who cared about her, and that was enough. She didn't have to carry the weight of this diagnosis alone. There would be tough days ahead, of course, but Margaret no longer saw herself as a victim. She had begun to embrace the reality of her condition, not as a sentence, but as a challenge to face with courage and grace. As the months passed, Margaret's progress was noticeable. Her memory lapses, though still present, became less frequent. She wasn't cured. There was no cure for MCI, but she had learned how to adapt, to create a life that worked with her changing brain rather than fighting against it. She began to feel a sense of agency, as though she had found a new rhythm in her life, one that allowed for both strength and vulnerability. Her journey wasn't about erasing the fear of cognitive decline, but about living fully, with intention despite it. One evening, as Margaret and Jim sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Margaret reflected on how far she had come. There had been moments of darkness, when the weight of the diagnosis felt unbearable, but those moments had slowly given way to light. She had taken the steps necessary to care for herself, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. She had learned that it was okay to ask for help, that it was okay to feel fear, and that it was okay to not have all the answers. "I'm proud of you," Jim said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft but filled with meaning. "You've done more than I ever thought possible. You're stronger than you know." Margaret smiled, squeezing his hand. "I'm proud of us," she said. "We're in this together." And as she sat there, watching the sky change from shades of pink to the deep blue of evening, Margaret felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would be uncertain, and there would still be challenges to face. But she had learned that the most important thing was not to fight against the fear, but to live with it. She wasn't defined by her diagnosis. She was defined by her actions, by her ability to love, to adapt, and to continue growing, no matter the circumstances. Margaret had found a new kind of strength, one that wasn't about perfection, but about resilience. She wasn't just surviving. She was living fully and unapologetically. And that, she realized, was all she needed. She had embraced the reality of her situation, and in doing so, she had found a new sense of purpose, a new way of moving forward. And that was enough.